It's 20 minutes past 4 and we have Dr. Taz Walker on the line from Creation Ministries International. And, of course, Creation Ministries have a website, creation.com, where you can go to get all sorts of questions answered. However, if you have any questions, we'd love you to send it through to us on our text line. That's 0401 949 949. Now, good afternoon, Dr. Taz.
Good afternoon, Max. Good to catch up with you again. We had a great conversation last week, didn't we? It was excellent.
Absolutely, talking about ages, and I'll tell you what, I was reading some news about a lungfish. Yeah, of all things, a lungfish, because apparently lungfish grow really old. And there's one in Australia that's about 92 years old. But interestingly, they were talking about how they could potentially date a fish with radiocarbon dating. Now, this particular article in Cosmos magazine, they said the carbon dating method only works on fish born after the 1940s and 1950s because it relies on carbon levels that changed because of nuclear bomb tests. What do you think of that?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. That's part of the issue. Because again, if I presume they would, the idea would be they would get a fish and they'd have to kill it and take a sample of it and do the testing on the sample. I guess you could take a sample of fish and not kill it, but anyway, but it wouldn't actually be. It would indicate it would be still alive. So you're looking for something that's dead in order to figure out when it died. So that's what carbon-14 works on. It works on the time when the fish or the particular organic thing died, whether it's a tree or coral or whatever it is. When it dies, it loses carbon-14. But when it's alive, like a tree, it exchanges breathes with the air and the carbon dioxide in the air, and that gets into the tree, and so it's in equilibrium. The same amount of carbon-14 in the air is in the tree, but when it dies, the carbon-14 in the tree, because it's dead, it starts decaying away. And so after 100,000 years, there'd be none left. It decays, half of it disappears every 5,000 years or so. And so that's based on how they work it out. But the big trouble
you say
is
every 5,000 years or so, but as they're saying here, because of nuclear bomb tests, well, that sort of changed everything. So, in the last 5,000 years, we don't know how many times it's changed.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. We know about the nuclear bomb test because people were alive, and so that's documented by people who were there and saw it happen, and we can work out how the carbon-14 changed at that time. But when you go back earlier than that, you haven't got a clue. You're just guessing. And they know that it's changed. They know it's not what it should be because it doesn't give answers which they think it should be, so they say there must be a problem. And so what they do is they calibrate it against trees. Did you know that? They call it, they dig up these trees out of bogs in Ireland and places like that, and they measure the carbon-14 in the trees, and they count the rings, and based on that, they try to do a calibration. And of course, you don't know when the tree rings were laid down, so you really don't know that either. So you're still guessing. So the fact that they calibrate this stuff, carbon-14, means that it's not a basic measuring thing. It's not trusted, and so it has to be checked against something else. So that's what we say all the time: is that it's not to be trusted, and it disagrees with ages of things which we know based on the Bible. The Bible's got history, and it's got the events recorded, and so because it disagrees with that, we say there must be a problem, and so that's why we don't. That's the issue with carbon-14.
Wow! Now you say tree rings. I mean, that's an interesting one. I spent many years in the Snowy Mountains and overseas in other snowy mountains, and I know I was a snow reporter. I know a lot about snow and the properties of snow. And so when they date, things like ice cores, they talk about the layers in the ice. Now, I know how inaccurate that is, because some years you'll get numerous layers and other years you actually mightn't get any. What about the tree rings? How accurate is that?
Well, that's exactly the same thing. Is that it's assumed? Basically, they assume that one ring is produced every year. That's the assumption. But the trouble is, most trees don't have enough rings to be able to count back very far. There might be only 1,000 rings on a living tree, so they have to find trees that are dead. And so they count the rings on the trees that are dead, and then they can't figure out, well, when did it die?
Yes.
So they try to match the rings on trees that are dead with other trees, and so there's a lot of, what would you put it? It's the scientific term would, it's very subjective. There's another way it would be, it's a lot of wriggle room. It's a very plastic assumptions, we would call it. And so, as I always say, and people might think I'm a bit rude, but I always say you can get any age you like, depending on what assumptions you make, because nobody was there to see it, and so you can make up your own age.
Yeah. Wow, that's interesting. Even the tree rings can be wrong.
That's right.
Yeah, I assume they look at, just going one ring, 1 year. But just like snow seasons, there'd be seasons with trees where they could potentially have a couple of rings or maybe none at all. Yeah,
that's right. And one of the trees that they use a lot is, they call it the bristlecone pines, which are in the mountains in, I think it's on the western coast of the US. And so they pick trees which are sitting up in the mountains and it's very dry. And to get the really old ones with lots of rings, they pick these really old trees, and they're half dead, to be able to count the tree rings. And what one sort of critique of it is that the trees don't produce any rings normally because it's so dry. But whenever there's a thunderstorm, it then starts to grow. And then it slows down and stops. And if there's another thunderstorm a month later, it produces some more growth. And so you can get multiple rings per year, just depending on, what was happening to the weather in the area.
Wow, there you go. Yep, I thought it was like that. You're on 94.9.
I suspected something like that, he
says. Yes, absolutely. Well, I knew that the whole ice core thing was a little bit sort of how you going, but didn't realise it was the same with trees, but I did suspect it. It is 28 minutes past 4. We'll be back with Dr. Taz very, very shortly. If you have any questions, please send them through to our text line, SMS 0401 949 949. That was Dupre. Live your life out loud. You're on 94.9. We almost heard it again. And, we've got Dr. Taz Walker with us right now, who has a Bachelor of Science, Earth Science, Bachelor of Engineering, Honours and PhD Mechanical Engineering. And he's a super smart dude that's with Creation Ministries International. And we love talking to these guys because they can tell us all about, like today, we're talking about ages of things. And we even had a little chat just before about a lungfish here in Australia that they said basically they can't carbon date because, there was, and by the way, this isn't a Christian magazine, this is a worldly magazine. They're saying, they couldn't do carbon dating because the carbon method only works after the 1940s and 50s because it relies on carbon levels that changed because of nuclear bomb tests. Yet we still get told that carbon dating is used all over the place, and I guess it gives you a rough idea. But, there's other methods of dating, which we talked about as well. I find it interesting. We look at this carbon dating. They say it doesn't really, work before the 40s and 50s. Yet, and even with this fish, they've come up with, these other methods to come up with the age. And they say, look, it's 92 plus or minus 9 years, which means it's anywhere between 83 years old and 101 years old. That's about a 20% difference. And, with that 20% difference on something that's under 100 years old, man, it doesn't give them much chance of getting it right when they say thousands and tens of thousands and even hundreds of thousands. What about the millions? When they start getting to the billions, you've got to start laughing. How do they get ages on things? What age can possibly be right then?
Well, how would you possibly know what the age of something is? And I talk about this a little bit in different contexts, and basically say there is no instrument that can measure the age, and we talked about that last week. And I said every age is based on assumption. So the guys have to work out an assumption, and based on this assumption, they then do a calculation. And that's what they do with carbon-14. They make an assumption. And as that article of yours said, that assumption doesn't apply after 1950 because of nuclear testing and that sort of thing. So you don't know what happened in the past, which is going to upset the assumptions. For example, during Noah's flood, there was a whole disruption, which it occurred about 4,500 years ago, but it upset the whole carbon balance.
Mm-hmm.
So there was lots of trees which have got carbon in them. They were all uprooted and buried, so you find coal, which is buried. And also there are lots of volcanoes which shoot out carbon dioxide, and so that's got different amounts of carbon-14 in it. And so the whole balance in the Earth was disrupted. And when they're calculating a carbon-14 age, they basically assume it's really been the same all the way, no matter how far you go back. But basically, it doesn't work. They find, there's problems with it. And so they then try to calibrate it against something else, which they don't know the age of either. And one of the things that they calibrate it against is trees, that are found in bogs, that sort of thing, which is really interesting. But the amazing thing about carbon-14 is it's got a reasonably shortish half-life. Half of it disappears in 5,700 years or something like that. And so in 11,000, 12,000 years, there'd only be a quarter left, and it gradually disappears. And so you would not expect any carbon-14 to be left after 100,000 years if something was 1,000 years or older. But
why can't they calibrate it with biblical age?
Well, you can if you could find a sample which you knew the age of it. And one of the things that they did try to test it against was some of the wood in some of the pyramids in Egypt, and they found that so they get a bit of a handle on that. And so they test the wood and they do the carbon-14 on that, and so they find that they also try to calibrate it against trees, which they don't really know the ages of those either. Trees are based on tree rings, and they don't know the ages of those either. But I'll tell you what really happens with the carbon-14. They use it to test against diamonds. Now, diamonds, they say, are not a million years old. They're not 100 million, but 1,000 million years old. So there should be no carbon-14 left in them if they are really 1,000 million years old. So anyway, there was a creation geologist whose name was John Baumgartner. He collected all these diamond samples and he sent them off to the carbon-14 laboratory and to get them tested. And guess what? They had carbon-14, which was amazing. They wouldn't have expected it to be there if they knew what the ages of the diamonds were, but he expected it to be. And so basically what that says is this is direct evidence that these diamonds are not billions of years old. They're only thousands of years old. And so that's direct evidence. But a person who believes in billions of years, and if you present them with that evidence and so really believe in it, they say, well, there must be some reason for that. And they won't say, the Earth is young after all. They'll say, there must be some reason for that. And so they'll start brainstorming to try to think of what could possibly be going on that could mean that there's carbon-14 in these diamonds. And so I don't think there's a satisfactory explanation come up yet, but there's been quite a number put forward, and some of those are discussed on creation.com as to various proposals that have been put forward, and and how they're not widely accepted at all. So it's really an interesting topic, and I always say you can get any age you like, depending on the assumptions you make. What age would you like? Which is really interesting. I tell you what, there is a way of knowing the age of something and really accurately, and which is surprising. People would wonder how to do that. And I
Yes.
call that the historical method. The
Yes.
historical method. And I say, well, look, I know my age. I know my age to within one day. And it's based on a birth certificate,
Yep.
which is history. My mother was there at the time, and there was a doctor that was there, and they wrote it down in a birth certificate. And as long as what they wrote down was true, and as long as the certificate hasn't been changed, then we know it's a reliable age, and that's
You got an
really
eyewitness.
how we know. Eyewitnesses. That's right, eyewitnesses. And it's interesting. The Bible says, "Let every matter be established on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses." The importance of witnesses. And it's interesting, isn't it, that that's how the resurrection of Jesus is based. They say, well, there were all these different people witnessed it. First of all, there was the Mary, and then there was Peter, and then there was others, and so it's based on witnesses. And so the Bible's got historical records of people who lived all the way back to the first man, who was Adam, and they record how old he was when he had a son called Seth, and then Seth was when he had a son called Enosh, and you can trace it through, and it's not hard to do. I can get some primary age kids to give them the passages of the Bible, and they can work it out really easy, how long it is between Adam and the flood, and you can work out that the Earth is around about 6,000 years old from today.
Yeah.
It's the only reliable way of knowing the age of something.
What do you say to
other methods?
What do you say to people that I mean, I've got some friends who know that, I believe the world is about 6,500 years old. And, very recently they all had a bit of a joke about it. Like, yeah, he believes it's only 6,500 years old. And what do you say to these people? Because it's so entrenched in their mind. Their belief system says it is millions and billions of years old, but that's based on, there's no evidence. It's based on assumptions.
That's right. It depends on how much they know, but one of the things I do is I ask them, so how do they know that it's that old? Do you know how they know? What do they do to work the age? And usually they'll say, they use carbon dating.
Yeah.
And so you just ask them about that, and then you say, carbon dating. Do you know what the half-life of carbon-14 is? There's no way it can measure millions of years, so there must be some other way they do it. Do you know what it is? And so, once they realize that, hey, I don't know much about this after all, and then you can ask them, so how do they make the measurements in the past to get the initial condition? Do you know how they did that? And do you know how they calibrate this? What have they got of known age that they know is 10 million years old? That's absolutely for sure. What are they calibrated against? And so I had an engineering training, and calibrating instruments was a really big deal, how to calibrate them and how they can go wrong and the various errors that can occur. And so with dating methods, they don't there's no way of calibrating them.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned about historical methods, there would be some. And so carbon-14, sort of going back, say, 2,000 or 3,000 years is probably not too far out of the ballpark. But even there, it gives some surprises. It gives some ages which are really bizarre, and due to various things. But once you go beyond that, the thing is you've got to take account of what happened during Noah's flood, and that makes a huge difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Well, it's awesome listening to what you have to say, Dr. Taz, because these sort of things, it's important for us to understand how to answer people when they do, like laugh at us when we, or me in particular, and I know there's other people just like me that know or have friends or family that will laugh at you and go, 6,500 years, ha, 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 ha. But at the end of the day, they're laughing at you not based on evidence that they know of. They're just laughing at you because they've heard the same thing thrown around so many times.
So many times. That's right. And I've heard stories about a guy, I can't think of his name just at the moment, but he was a sort of very died in the heart atheist, and he met a fellow at work. He works for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and this guy was a Christian, and he thought, he sort of made a bit of fun of him and that, and the guy just kept asking him questions. Well, how do you know this, and how do you know that? And so he would go out and try to figure out, well, how do we know it? And as a result of that, he realized, we don't know at all. And so I think the questions is a very good way to go, finding out where people are at.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Well, Dr. Taz, it is that time again. Another week is up, but we've got you again next week,
happen?
I believe. I know it does.
Am I on next week?
I think so.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Well, if I am, it's good, and if I'm not, it's not good. But it'd be good to catch up with you again.
Well, I certainly hope you are, because it just seems to go so quick when we're talking to you, and it was very interesting, and love looking at all these different dating methods, and I was intrigued to see this story today, though, the lungfish, and they said, no, we can't.
I'm going to dig that out and have a look at it.
Yeah, it's in Cosmos magazine. Definitely check that out. And, the fact that they're saying we can't do carbon dating before the 1950s, well, wow, they've just, next week there'll be another one, though, and they'll say you can. That's just the way it goes.
So I think it's really great what you do. I think it's really great what you do, and questioning these things is a good thing. And I know a guy that calls it putting a stone in someone's shoe.
Yes.
They're so confident, and then you drop something in which which they can't sort of get out of their mind, and it creates this question. And I think that's a good thing for people to actually question things and to think about, how do we know what we know is true?
Yes,
that's good.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Dr. Taz. Another fantastic week. Hey, if you have any questions for Dr. Taz next week, please send them through to our text line. It's 0401 949 949. You are on 94.9 and it is 9 minutes to 5.